work. Okay. So today we're going to talk about Jesus being the greater Melchizedek. We're going to focus on Hebrews 7 and um, try to make it through the whole thing. We'll see. It's going to be pretty dense. So to start out here, let me stop sharing. I just want to make sure the sharing worked. Okay. To start out, um, we got to remember, what is the whole author of Hebrews writing about? Well, he's writing about trying to convince Jews who have become Christians to not go back to Judaism. A lot of and I think if you think about the external pressures, there's probably, I mean, we don't know exactly when Hebrews was written, but at this time, there's probably 95% of people are Jews and maybe 5% of people are Christians. It far outweighs Christianity in numbers, and in power. And there are some hints that Hebrews was written before AD 70. So it's very possible that the temple was still standing and priests were still offering sacrifices. I know it's up for debate, but I think there's some decent evidence that it was still around. So that's the context. He's trying to convince these people, don't go back to Judaism. Christianity is better. Jesus is better. Here's a ton of reasons why. And he or she loves to use the Old Testament to prove that, to say, look, your own scriptures show you that this coming Messiah was going to be greater. He was going to fulfill things that the Old Testament law couldn't do. So he's come, so believe in him. Don't turn back. And I like to compare this to kind of our situation, as many of us here are Unitarians. There might be a few Trinitarians in the call, but our situation as Unitarians, we're the vast minority. And you think about how many external pressures there are to become Trinitarian. I know a lot of us would get jobs. A lot of us would have a lot more social um, abilities, more social um, I don't know, just a higher status, essentially. Immediately, if you say I'm a Unitarian, you immediately are looked down on. And I think that's kind of what it would be like as a Christian in the first century. If you say you're a Christian, immediately the Jews are going to be thinking, oh man, these people are crazy. They believe in this false Messiah who died. Um, so there's just a lot of external pressure that I think we could actually relate to as Unitarians. Um, so the author of Hebrews has been detailing how Jesus is better than angels, how he's better than Moses, how he's the better high priest. And now he talks about how he's basically the fulfillment of who Melchizedek was. And he's after the greater that term order of Melchizedek, rather than the order of Aaron and Levi. So that's what he's going to be arguing in Hebrews 7. So let's go read real fast. We know very, very little about Melchizedek. So let's go read Genesis 14. I can pull that up real fast. I can share my screen. Oh no, this font is still small. Okay, let me just do it here. Okay, Genesis 14. So we're going to start at 17 here, right here. But a little bit of context. So essentially, Chedorlaomer, Chedorlaomer, it's a really hard name to say. I always mess it up. The king of Elam, he had a bunch of kings fighting with him against the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Chedorlaomer won and took spoils from Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot was part of that. Lot, Abraham's brother's son, was part of that spoil that was taken. So Abraham's like, well, I'm going to go chase him down. And so he does, he defeats him, and then we arrive here at verse 17. So Genesis 14:17. Then, after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. So the loser, king of Sodom, is going out to meet him in the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, and he was a high priest, and sorry, he was a priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has given your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of all the spoils. Um, so I'd like to point out, it's really interesting. Melchizedek kind of comes out of nowhere. If you read the story starting up in verse 1, Melchizedek isn't one of these kings. There's five kings on one side, four kings on the other. And Melchizedek just shows up. And he's like, Hey, I'm going to bring you a gift, Abraham, because you honor God Most High. So I think that kind of appeals to the mystery of who Melchizedek is. He just kind of appears in the story out of nowhere. Um, and if you notice, he's really honorable. The first words out of his mouth here in verse 19, Blessed be Abram of God Most High. What are the first words out of the king of Sodom's mouth? Give me the people. He's selfish. But the first words out of Melchizedek's mouth are Blessed be Abram. He's this like prototypical figure that's demonstrating faith. So there we go. Let me stop sharing. Um, the first thing to note is that Salem, he's the king of Salem. That's very, very likely. I think there's a connection there in the Psalms that's the first name of Jerusalem. So Salem was Jerusalem. So again, that's a very beautiful prototypical connection there. He's the king of Salem, of Jerusalem. Well, who's Jesus? Well, he's the king of the Jews. Where's their capital? Jerusalem. So you have a beautiful connection there between Melchizedek and Jesus. Then it says that he brings out bread and wine. Um, where is this? Verse 18, Genesis 14:18. He says that he brought out bread and wine. And this actually isn't like that like grand of a gesture like gold or silver or lambs or oxen. That would be maybe a more highly sought after gift. But he just brings out bread and wine, which is just very basic. It's like your prototypical meal in the ancient world. And so you might think, oh, this is an insult. Like, why is he only bringing out bread and wine? Well, I think it's because I think maybe why the author of Genesis only mentions this is because it again typifies Jesus. The bread, the body of Jesus, the wine, the blood of Jesus. So I think there's something else going on there. It might just be ordinary. It might just be that he brought out bread and wine for no reason. But I think there's a good chance that this was particularly written down to foreshadow the offering of Jesus. Um, and then lastly, I think the last important thing to note about this story in Genesis 14 is that Melchizedek, he's a priest, right? But you think about when we think about what a priest does, it's standing before the altar, it's wearing certain clothes, it's sacrificing certain animals for certain sins. But it's really likely that Melchizedek didn't do any of that because the law hadn't been given yet. So how could he rightly be called a priest? Well, a priest is just someone who has access to God. It's someone through who a people would go to get access to God. And the really cool thing about Melchizedek is not only was he a priest, but he was also a king. So he's one of the, correct me if I'm wrong, he might be the only priest king in the Bible. I'd love to know if anybody else has any other person in mind for that. But obviously, Jesus is the prophet, priest, and king. He fulfills all three roles. But Melchizedek is the only priest and king. He's the only king who's leading a nation who actually has access to God. So I think that's a really interesting thing. So when we think about him being a priest, we don't need to think about, oh, he's sacrificing animals constantly. It's very likely he wasn't doing that. He might have made a few sacrifices, but it's very likely that simply he was somebody who um, had genuine faith in God and therefore had some sort of connection where he could pray to God. The people could intercede, he could intercede for the people on their behalf. So those are the things I wanted to point out in Genesis 14. The only other place we know about Melchizedek is in Psalm 110:4. Classic psalm. You should definitely have it as a go-to psalm anytime somebody's like, "Where's Jesus in the Old Testament?" Psalm 110 is always a great thing to remember. Um, so Psalm 110 says, Yahweh has sworn, and he will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the pattern of Melchizedek. So that's the only other place. There, literally, the rest of rest of the Old Testament is completely silent about who Melchizedek is. So then we arrive here at Hebrews 7, 1 through 2. So let me share my screen again, and we will read that. So it says, For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of God Most High, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, and to whom Abraham divided a tenth part of all the spoils, was first of all, by the translation of his name, King of Righteousness, and then also King of Salem, that is, King of Peace. So it's really important to note that all throughout chapter 7, he's purposely looking for attributes that Melchizedek has that later get fulfilled in Jesus. So that's like literally the purpose of what he's doing. If you read verse 3 right here, he says, he's without father and mother. We'll read that in a second. But he says, but resembling the Son of God. This is the point. He's bringing up Melchizedek to show how he resembles Jesus. And so he actually makes a lot of connections here that you probably would never make if you're just reading the story of Melchizedek. But he makes them because he's purposely trying to find Jesus in the Old Testament. He's purposely trying to find Jesus in the story of Melchizedek. So he goes on to say here, in verse 2, Melchizedek is the king of righteousness, which resembles the Son of God. But there's some really interesting Old Testament prophecies concerning the Messiah that he would be righteous. So the author of Hebrews here is particularly pointing out, hey, look, Melchizedek means king of righteousness. So it's Melech in Hebrew, but it's like Melch, I guess would be the cutoff. Um, that means king. Melech means king, and then Zedek or Zadok, means righteous. So it's the king of righteousness. So he's purposely, transliterating his name to show, look, this is how he prefigures Christ. He's the king of righteousness. Who's Jesus? Well, he's the king of righteousness too. But if we read Jeremiah 23:5, it says, Behold, the days are coming, says Yahweh, that I will raise for David a righteous branch, and he will reign as king and deal wisely, and will execute justice and righteousness in the land. So this is particularly a prophecy about Jesus. Just as a reminder, there's a lot of Old Testament passages that aren't actually prophecies, but the New Testament says, this was to fulfill this. Like Hosea 11:1 is a great example where he says, out of Israel I called my son. That's specifically talking about Israel in the Exodus. But I think it's Matthew, maybe Mark, who applies it to Jesus. And he's like, look, Jesus went to Egypt and then he came back. So out of Egypt, he called his son. It's like, wait a second, that had nothing to do with, that was not a prophecy about Jesus. That was about Israel. But the New Testament author found fulfillment in it in Jesus. But this is a different example. Jeremiah 23:5 is a different example. It's a particular prophecy about the Messiah. And it says he would be a righteous branch and he will execute justice and righteousness in the land. So if we're looking for this Messiah, who's this Messiah going to be? He's going to be righteous. He's going to be a righteous branch from David. So it makes sense why the author of Hebrews would point this out about Melchizedek. The second thing the author of Hebrews points out about Melchizedek in verse 2 is that he's the king of Salem or the king of peace. He's kind of transliterating that from shalom in Hebrew, which means peace. So again, he's pointing out there's a lot of things he could probably point out, but he's purposely pointing out these things about Melchizedek because they have a fulfillment in Jesus. So let's read another prophecy about the Messiah, that he would be one full of peace and that he would bring peace on the earth. So Zechariah 9, 9 through 10, it reads, Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. Behold, your king comes to you. He is righteous and having salvation, lowly and riding on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a donkey. I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow will be cut off, and he will speak peace to the nations. That's the key right there. He will speak peace to the nations, and his dominion will be from sea to sea, and from the river and to the ends of the earth. So again, what is the Messiah going to do? He's going to bring peace, and he's going to speak peace to the nations. So the author of Hebrews is finding this connection in Melchizedek and saying, look, Jesus is the greater Melchizedek. He's the greater king of peace, who Melchizedek was just foreshadowing. So let's go back to Hebrews 3 now. Sorry, Hebrews 7, 3. So continuing, it says, without father, without mother, this is talking about Melchizedek, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest for all time. So you could totally read that. Here, I'll stop sharing for a second. You could totally read that and conclude, wow, does that mean Melchizedek never died? I mean, it specifically says he has no beginning of days nor end of life. Like, you really can't say it much clearer. And we need to be fair to the Bible, right? We don't need to just immediately throw this off and be like, well, there's no way Melchizedek could have lived forever. That's just, it can't be what it says. We need to be careful and think, okay, are there clues in the text that tell us that maybe he's not speaking literally here? Well, if you look at verse 3, he says, without father, without mother. Now, he's a human. Melchizedek is a human. The story in Genesis, he's a human. He's a priest, so that means he's not God. If you're a priest, that means you're a mediator between God and man. So we know for a fact Melchizedek is not God or a God figure. He's a man. So in verse 3, to say without father or mother, he has to be speaking figuratively there. Of course, he had a father and a mother, or else he wouldn't be a human. So I think is what his point is in Hebrews 7:3, and this is what most scholars would agree with, is that the Jewish people didn't have any records of his father or mother, and they didn't have any records of who came after him. So he kind of became this mysterious figure, as I mentioned earlier, who appeared on the scene, had faith in Yahweh, blessed Abraham, or yeah, he blessed Abraham. Abraham gave him a tithe, and then he disappeared from the scene. He's this mysterious priest who's not from the line of Levi. So I think that's why he uses this. So we have to realize, because of verse 3, he's not speaking literally. He's not saying he literally doesn't have a father and mother, but it's as if he doesn't have a father or mother because we don't know his genealogy. Um, so that's very, very important for understanding the rest of Hebrews 7 here. So let me share my screen again. Verse 4. Um, Now consider how great this man was. So again, this is really important to note. He's called a man here. It's not like, now consider how great this divine God man was, or how great this angel was who appeared like a man. No, he talks about Melchizedek as a man. So that's how we should be interpreting it. So when we go back to verse 3, we shouldn't be thinking, oh, this is some sort of eternal divine God man, which I know a lot of people actually think that Melchizedek literally was Jesus. There's some Trinitarians who believe that. I would just push back and say, no, it specifically calls him a man and that he resembles the Son of God, not that he is the Son of God. So, verse 4, now consider how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a tenth out of the best of the spoils of war. So, um, yeah, I'll go ahead and read. Sorry, let me share again. I'll go ahead and read verse 5 and 7. And those of the sons of Levi who receive the priest's office have a commandment to collect tithes from the people according to the law, that is, from their brothers, although they also have come out of the loins of Abraham. But he whose genealogy is not counted from them has taken tithes from Abraham and has blessed him who has the promises. But without any dispute, the less is blessed by the better. So this is the important statement and kind of his purpose statement here. So basically, Melchizedek blessed Abraham. His very basic point is Melchizedek blessed Abraham, so therefore Melchizedek is better. The better person always blesses the lesser person. God blesses humans. We don't, I mean, in a sense, you could say we bless God. I think there are some Psalms that say that. Bless the Lord, oh my soul. But I think that's a different context of blessing. I don't think it's like, I have the power, God, to give you blessings. It's a different sense of the word. But his principle here is that, the lesser gets blessed by the greater. So since Melchizedek blessed Abraham, Melchizedek and the order of Melchizedek, which Jesus is greater than the order of Abraham and Levi. So, another point that he makes here is that Abraham gave a tithe to Melchizedek. So, Melchizedek is better. So, not only did Melchizedek bless Abraham, but Abraham gave a tithe to Melchizedek. And what's the principle here? Well, the principle is that you always give tithes to things that are greater and better. In Leviticus 27:30, Israel was to give 10% from their land to God, to Yahweh. So the lesser gives tithes to the greater. That's the principle. So since Abraham gave a tithe to Melchizedek, Melchizedek is greater. And again, you have to remember here, we don't know anything about Melchizedek. So was he really truly a greater man than Abraham? Maybe, maybe not. We don't really know. But again, the author of Hebrews' point is he's trying to find anything about Melchizedek that's greater, and he's using that to demonstrate how Jesus is greater than the old covenant. So you might say that he's making some stretches in interpretation, but his point is valid and his point makes sense. So let's continue. Verse 8. And in the one case, men who die receive tithes. But in the other case, he, about whom it is testified that he lives, aka Melchizedek, receives them. So in one case, in the Levitical priesthood, men who die receive the tithe. So these are lesser men who are receiving the tithes. But in our case, or in the other case of Melchizedek, he's greater. He lives. He doesn't die. Now, again, does this mean that he literally doesn't die? Probably not. But his point is that we don't know his genealogy. We don't know who came after him. We don't know his father and mother. So he never died. That's the idea. Um, so That is verse 8. Let's go on to verse 9 and 10. And so to speak, oh, sorry. And so to speak, even Levi, who receives tithes, has paid tithes through Abraham. Now, this is a confusing phrase. We're going to get to this in a second. For he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. So, what does this mean? So to speak, so this is a very key phrase, and so to speak. So he's saying not literally, this isn't literally what happened, but it's as if Levi paid tithes to Melchizedek through Abraham. So this is a really big clue to how we're understanding this entire Hebrews chapter 7. He is trying to find Jesus in the story of Melchizedek. So he's making connections that didn't literally happen, but they prefigure Christ. So I want to show you a helpful illustration here. So this is essentially what he's saying here. Hopefully y'all can see this. Can we get a Rob, can you give a thumbs up if you can see this? Okay. So Jewish tithes, essentially his argument is that, look, your tithes, if you're a Jew, they go to the Levites, but then they go to Melchizedek. So if you're going to say who's the greatest, if you look at this kind of flow of tithes, who's the greatest in this? It's Melchizedek. He's the end, kind of the end point. He's saying, look, even Levi kind of gave tithes through the Levites, through Abraham, to Melchizedek. So Melchizedek is greater. This is his whole point. Melchizedek is greater than the Levitical priesthood. So it's an interesting, again, it's kind of a weird thing. It didn't literally happen, but he's making this as an illustration to prove why Jesus, someone after the order of Melchizedek, is greater than the Jewish system and the Jewish law. So, verse 11, now if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it, the people, again, this is Israel, for under it, the people, Israel, received the law. What further need was there for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek and not be reckoned after the order of Aaron? So you kind of have to read in between the lines here. What is he saying? He's saying, go back to Psalm 110:4 right here. He's going to talk about it more clearly in a second. But Psalm 110:4, the Lord swore and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So why he's saying here in verse 11, why would God make that promise if the order of Aaron was good enough? Why do we want to get rid of Aaron? Why do we need somebody after the order of Melchizedek if the order of Aaron was good enough? Well, it's because it wasn't good enough. We needed a new God. We needed a new promise, a new savior, a new order, and a new priest. So this is what he's saying here in verse 11. Um, you kind of have to read in between the lines there. He's referencing Psalm 110:4. Verse 12. For when the priesthood is changed, there's also of necessity, there is a change in the law. Because again, if you're going to change the priesthood, then it's not the same law. If you're not following, if you don't have Levites, people after the bloodline of Levi, being your priests, then you're under a different law. You are not following the law of Moses. So if a priesthood is changed, then the law has also changed. This is a very, very clear verse for why we are not under the Mosaic law. Why? Because we have a different priest. He's not a priest after the order of Levi. He's a priest from Judah, as he talks about here in a second. So, of course, there's going to be a new law because there's a new priest and high priests, especially. Um, so if we look at Hebrews 8:13 real fast, right here, he says, when he speaks of a new covenant, he has made the first one obsolete. But that which is being made obsolete and growing aged is close to vanishing away. So this actually is a verse as to why I think perhaps This is written before 70 AD, before the temple has been destroyed, because he's saying it's close to vanishing away. I have a feeling if the temple had been destroyed already, he would have said it is vanishing away, or sorry, it has vanished away. Because obviously at this point, right, the new covenant has already started. We are already under the new covenant. They are already under the new covenant. So he has made the first one obsolete. It's over. But there's still some part of it that hasn't yet vanished away. And I think that has to do with um, the temple that is still standing. Um, again, I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts on that too. There's other verses we could talk about for that, but um, that is not the purpose of this. So going on to verse 13. So this is a super important verse, verse 12. For when the priesthood is changed, there's also of necessity a change in the law. Verse 13. For the one whom these things are spoken about belongs to another tribe from which no one has ever officiated at the altar. So no one has ever been a priest from Judah. That is his point. Verse 14, for it is clear that our Lord descended from Judah. And in connection with that tribe, Moses said nothing concerning the priests. So Moses gave no directions. If you're a Jude, like if you come from the tribe of Judah, he didn't tell you how to become a priest. Why? Because you're not supposed to, because that's the old law. And under the old law, you should be from the tribe of Levi. Verse 15, and this is even clear if another priest like Melchizedek arises. And he's speaking again kind of figuratively here because Jesus has already arisen. And he is after the order. He is like Melchizedek. So Jesus is already here at this point, but he's just kind of doing a hypothetical statement here. This is even clear if another priest like Melchizedek arises. So what's clear? What is this? What is even clear? It's that we're under a new law and we're under a new priesthood. That's what's clear. We're going to get to this in a second. I'm going to explain this a little bit more in a second. Verse 16, who has been made a so let me read it together so it's not complicated or not confusing. Verse 15, and this is even clear if another priest like Melchizedek arises, who has been made a priest not on the basis of a legal regulation concerning the flesh, so not because he descended from Levi, that's not why he was a priest, but on the basis of the power of an endless life. So again, did Melchizedek literally live forever? Probably not. I mean, I'm not going to go and say 100% sure. I know for without a shadow of a doubt he did not live forever. I think it's very, very, very likely that he didn't. But again, he's making a point. His point is that Melchizedek, we don't know who his genealogy was. Nobody came after him. There was no priests after him. So it's kind of like he lived forever. So that's the same way that Jesus became a priest. It wasn't because he was from the tribe of Levi, he was from the tribe of Judah. But he became a priest. Why? Because of the power of an endless life. As Romans 1 talks about, he was raised as the Son of God with power. So, um, yeah, that's the connection there with Jesus. Verse 17, for it is testified of him, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So again, it's not that he is Melchizedek, but it's after the order. It's like Melchizedek didn't have any descendants. There were no priestly descendants after Melchizedek. The only one is Jesus. He's the one that's like Melchizedek. Um, okay, so to clarify real fast again, just to try to be clear with this verse 15, which is kind of strange. He's basically saying that there's been a change of priesthood, which is made clear by the fact that one, his first point, is that Jesus was from the tribe of Judah, verse 14 here. Jesus was from the tribe of Judah, not from the tribe of Levi. So that's why it's clear that there's been a change. And his second point, that's even clearer why there's been a change in the priesthood, is because he's from the order of Melchizedek. Boom. He's from a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So that's the second point, why it's even clearer that there has been a change in the priesthood. So hopefully that makes sense. That's verses 15 through 17. Verse 18. For on the one hand, the former commandment is annulled because of its weakness and uselessness. Yikes. That's going to be some strong language. If you're a Jew and you hear that, you're going to be probably a little upset. Um, but it's true. It did not actually, Romans 8 talks about how the law could never actually condemn sin in the flesh. So it was weak. Um, he actually uses that same language in Romans 8. It was weakened by the flesh. Um, verse 19, for the law made nothing perfect. So again, this is the weakness. This is the uselessness. This is the weakness of the law. It didn't make anything perfect. The priests had to keep going back and uh, not back and forth, back day after day after day and perform sacrifices. Why? Because it could never actually take away sin. It could only cover sin temporarily. And I'm going to talk about that more in a second. Continuing, so the law was weak, useless. The law made nothing perfect. And on the other hand, there is a bringing in of a better hope through which we draw near to God. So again, he's using this language here, this language of draw near to God. This is priestly language. What does a priest do? They draw near to God. So we draw near to God through Jesus, the greater high priest, the greater Melchizedek. And he's trying to say here to the Jews that there's a better, sorry, Jewish Christians that are thinking about going back to Judaism, there is a better hope. So don't go back. You have a better hope in Christianity than you do in the Jewish faith. So don't go back. Um, that is his point. And I would like to also point out here the law made nothing perfect. This was the weakness and the uselessness of the law. Well, what could make things perfect? What could make sinners perfect? Jesus. So again, all this is contrasting with Jesus, who's the better hope, who could actually make us perfect. So it's a really beautiful passage. Verse 20 through 22, I'm going to read that chunk. And since it was done, sorry, excuse me, since it was done with the taking of an oath, for they indeed became priests without an oath. So this is talking about the priests of the tribe of Levi. They became priests without an oath. But he, Jesus, became a priest with an oath sworn by God, who says of him, the Lord swore and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. Wow. So not only is it, so the Old Testament priests, they didn't take an oath to become priests. Jesus did, and it wasn't just an ordinary oath, it was an oath from God himself, swearing on himself or swearing by himself, which means it literally will not be broken. He literally says, I will, or the Lord will not change his mind. So again, he's saying, uh, well, here, let me finish real fast. Verse 22, according to such an oath, Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant. Again, he uses this language here, guarantee. Where is he getting that from? He's getting that from the idea that the Lord swore and the Lord will not change his mind. So therefore, it's a guarantee. Um, what I was going to, I'm kind of forgetting what I was going to say, but uh, yeah, essentially, Jesus is clearly the guarantee of a better covenant. So Jesus, the Lord swore and will not change his mind that he is a priest forever. Maybe it'll come back to me. Let me see. Okay. So again, his whole point here is that Jesus is the better priest. So, oh, I was gonna say, this is what I was gonna say, that even in the Old Testament, this basically he's saying, look at your own scriptures. From your own scriptures, The Old Testament, the Levitical priesthood fell short. It needed to be replaced. There was going to be a priest that was going to last forever. So don't go back to the Levitical priesthood. It was always meant to be replaced. It was always meant, not meant to fall short, but it always did fall short. Um, and I'd like to point out also, again, what the author of Hebrews does. This is not just in chapter 7, but all throughout Hebrews, he uses the Old Testament to establish his points. So he's not just saying, hey, Jesus is better. You need to become Christians. Come on, guys. Jesus is better. No, he's saying from your own scriptures, Jesus is better. From your own scriptures, the Messiah was supposed to be greater, and your law was always going to fall short, and your priesthood was always going to fall short. So come, stay in Christianity. Don't go back. That's his point. So I just wanted to point out, he uses the Old Testament really powerfully, I think. Verse 23 through 35, or sorry, 23 through 25. And the former priests, on the one hand, were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. But he, on the other hand, because he remains forever, has an unchangeable priesthood. And consequently, for all time, he is able to save those who draw near to God. Again, he uses that draw near language. Those who draw near to God through him, because he always is alive to make intercession for them. So, Jesus is greater than the Jewish priests because they died and they weren't able to keep intercession over and over and over again. They died. They only could do it for, 100 years max. But Jesus can make intercession forever. And I want to point out, in verse 25, his sacrifice was for all time. This is a huge, huge difference between the Mosaic law, as is pointed out, in I think it's Hebrews 9 and 10, that the priests had to offer the sacrifices daily. Why? Because the blood of bulls and goats could never take away sins. But how beautiful is this? In Hebrews 7:25, he can save for all time those who draw near to God. So what is his point here? His point is that Jesus is greater than the Jewish priests because they died and he's eternal. And obviously, he died for 3 days, but his point is that he's eternal and continues to live. So he can continually make intercession. So if you want greater intercession for you, don't go back to Judaism. Stay in Christianity. You're going to have greater intercession from Jesus, the great high priest, than you would if you ever went back to Judaism. So that is, I think, his point here in 23 through 25. So let me share my screen again for 26. We'll read 26 through 28. For it is appropriate for us to have such a high priest, one who is devout, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. Wow, that's really beautiful language. Verse 27, who does not need to offer up sacrifices daily, like those high priests, first for his own sins, and then for the sins of the people. Again, he uses this phrase, the people here, that's Israel. For this he did once and for all when he offered up himself. So he doesn't need to do daily sacrifices like the high priests. He can just offer up himself. Verse 28, for the law appoints men as high priests who have weaknesses, but the word of the oath, which came after the law, appoints the Son who has been made perfect forever. So there's a few things. This is almost like a summary statement, but he's just showing how many things are greater about this new covenant and about Jesus. He's like, the law appoints men as high priests who have weaknesses. Well, Jesus doesn't have weaknesses. That's his whole point here. He's devout, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners. So Jesus is greater. What's another greater thing about the new covenant? It was made through an oath. That's not the case with the Old Testament and the old Levitical priesthood. So that's greater. It came after the law. So in a sense, you could say it replaces the law. Um, and he appoints the Son. Again, even this, the title that Jesus is the Son of God, that's a greater title than being a high priest. Yes, a high priest is great, but you're not the Son of God. You're a Son of God, but not the Son of God. And then lastly, he says, who has been made perfect forever. So again, it's not, he can actually make perfect, which what did we see from the Jewish law that couldn't? Here in verse 19, the law could not make anything perfect. Jesus could, and he could do it forever. So he literally points out like six different things in this one verse about how Jesus is greater than the law of Moses and the old covenant and the fulfillment of the old covenant. Okay, so one thing I want to point out here real fast, I'll stop sharing. I One really, really important thing to remember for always when you're reading the Old Testament is that the Old Testament sacrifices, and this is something I had to study a lot because I don't think it's super, super clear in scripture. Um, but one thing to remember is that the Old Testament sacrifices were never intended, nor could they actually provide life in the age to come or eternal life. So in Hebrews 9 or 10, I think, he talks about how essentially you could be made perfect through the law, and that the blood of bulls and goats, Hebrews 10:4, could never take away sins. So not only could it not take away sins, I don't think that was even the purpose of the Old Testament law. And you never see that in the promises in the Old Testament. When you read through Leviticus, uh, let me read a quick example real fast. He says, like Leviticus 4:35, the priests will burn them into smoke on the altar for an offering to Yahweh made by fire. And the priest will make atonement for him, this is for the sinner, concerning his sin that he has sinned, and he will be forgiven. So if we have our New Testament hats on, we might read that and think, oh, he's forgiven. He has everlasting life. He has life in the age to come. No, that's not ever promised in the Old Testament. That's not necessarily what forgiveness entails. Forgiveness is about, and specifically, he mentions the word atonement, and that's all throughout Leviticus. But atonement is about being right with God in this life. So the Jews didn't have access to eternal life. They were looking forward to it. Hebrews 11, they were looking forward to the promise. They were looking forward to the heavenly city, but they didn't have it. So the Old Testament laws were never intended to take away sin completely, nor could they do that. That's why we needed a better sacrifice in Jesus. So I'd just like to point out the main point of the Old Testament sacrificial system was to be right with God in this life. It wasn't about how to be right with God in the next life. That's not what it was about. It was about how can I be right with the God of the universe now? How can I not be on the wrong side of Yahweh? Because if you're on the wrong side of Yahweh, you get kicked out of the land, you get defeated by your enemies, you don't get the blessings of rain and crops. All those things happen when you're not right with Yahweh in an Old Testament context. So they're very concerned with how do I stay right? How am I made right with God? How do I have atonement? Well, it's through the sacrificial system. So I just think that's really, really important to remember when we're reading the Old Testament and you're seeing words like forgiveness and atonement. It's not the same sense that it is in the New Testament, where forgiveness is a totality thing. You are totally forgiven. You are made perfect, which the law could not do. And you have life in the age to come, which didn't happen through the law of Moses. So that's just a very important thing to remember as you're reading through the Old Testament. And I think the author of Hebrews really makes that very clear. So, in conclusion, I just wanted to point out that not everything in the Bible has to be about us, and it doesn't have to be about our situation. So this is not about us at all. This is about, I don't know how many of you are in this situation. I'm not in this situation where I was a Jew, I became a Christian, and I'm thinking about going back to Judaism. That's not me. I'm sure it's probably not a lot of us. But what does this do? This beautiful teaching in Hebrews 7 teaches us that Jesus accomplished what the law and the high priests never could. So there was this problem. There's this problem of sin and this problem of atonement, and they could never actually make you perfect. So what Hebrews 7 teaches us is that Jesus is the greater high priest. Jesus is the high priest that could actually atone for sins once and for all. So I think it really does have a great fulfillment in that, we can read Hebrews and see, wow, he really is the Jewish Messiah. He's not just a great teacher, he's the Jewish Messiah. He's the one who could actually save us from our sins. Um, so although it's not written to us, I think we can find great hope in this story. So thank you all for listening.